This recording is non-profit recording on Audio Wall. Books fanfic for those people that has problem with reading and have mental disabilities. Darkside by Tom Becker. Published June 6, 2007. Narrated by Brian Mail from voicemaker.in. Chapter 3. Outside, the weather was getting worse. A violent wind harassed Jonathan and Mrs. Elwood as they scurried across the hospital car park, and raindrops exploded on the tarmac. It was a relief to get back into the car. They caught their breath in silence, the only sound the water dripping from Jonathan's fringe. Mrs. Elwood paused with her fingers on the car keys, the gloom unable to mask the pensive expression on her face. Jonathan didn't know how the tiny woman had come to play such a large role in his life. There were countless mysteries and unanswered questions about his family, and Alan Starling declined to shed light on any of them. All Jonathan did know was that her constant, protective presence had been there for as long as he could remember. When Jonathan had been given a small role in his primary school play, it had been Mrs. Elwood who had sat in the audience and clapped at the end. She had been the one who had picked him up from the police station after he had been accused of shoplifting, and when Alan had been seriously ill a few years ago, it had been Mrs. Elwood who arrived unannounced in the kitchen, saying that she had bought a house down the street from the Starlings. She visited the house most days, and was the closest thing to a mum that Jonathan had. He had no idea what had happened to his real mum. Teresa Starling had disappeared before he was old enough to even remember her face. Alan protected the meeknery of his wife behind a shroud of silence, and refused to say a word on the subject. When Jonathan was 10, he had used a fishing trip to the local canal as an opportunity to ask his dad about Teresa. After 30 painful seconds, Alan had marched off, leaving Jonathan alone with all the fishing gear. It was the angriest he had ever seen his dad. He didn't bother asking after that. His mum was gone and she wasn't coming back. All he was left with was her name. "I know it's silly," cut in Mrs. Elwood, with a slight tremble in her voice. "I mean, I've seen him like that before, but it still upsets me. I hope he won't be in hospital too long this time." "Yeah, maybe." Alan usually recovered in a few days, but there had been times when it had taken a lot longer. When Jonathan was 10, his dad had lain frozen and silent for 6 months, and the doctors had told Mrs. Elwood that it was unlikely he was ever going to get better. In his darkest moments, Jonathan wondered whether it might have been for the best if he had not woken up a couple of mornings later. Most of the time it didn't seem like his dad wanted to be alive. "You are going to stay with me while he recovers?" Jonathan grimaced. "Do we have to have this argument again? You know I like to sleep in my own bed. I'll be fine in the house. It worked okay last time he was ill, didn't it?" "I don't know," she said dubiously. "You were only down the road. Come on, it's not like I see anything of Dad when he's well." Mrs. Elwood sighed. "Yes, love. I know that. Look, we'll see how things go tonight. Just make sure you keep your mobile on. Any problems, give me a call. You promise?" Jonathan made a mock scout salute. "On my honor." She started up the engine, and within an hour they were back outside Jonathan's house in a leafy area of North London. Its imposing walls stood firm against the onslaught of the rain, and the knotted undergrowth of the garden remained unmoved by the howling protest of the wind. Jonathan started to get out of the car, and then paused. "Thanks," he said finally. She smiled. "That's okay. It's not easy being you, I know that, but you're doing fine." He gave her a humorless chuckle, and slammed the car door shut. Jonathan had lived here for as long as he could remember. In a rare moment of openness, Alan had said they had lived somewhere else when he was a baby, some small, unnamed town up north. Where he had found the money to pay for this house was a mystery. There certainly wasn't much now, barely enough for food and school uniforms, let alone holidays and doing up the house. Jonathan noted that the weeds were winning their battle with the driveway, and that the house was in desperate need of a lick of paint and some new guttering. He fumbled around in his pockets for the front door key, and entered his home. It was only slightly warmer inside than it had been outside, but at least he was out of the rain. A draft came charging across the wooden floor to greet Jonathan, gnawing hungrily at his ankles. Shivering, he flicked the hall switch on, and a bulb flickered into life high up on the ceiling. In the gloom, familiar things assumed ominous, alien shapes. Up the grand staircase, the pitch-black landing seemed to be hiding secrets and dangers. Jonathan felt a sudden urge to break the silence. "Hello," he called out. There was no response. He shrugged. This was ridiculous. It was his house. After all, it wasn't as if he was a toddler. Jonathan had spent many nights alone, not knowing whether Alan was in the house, locked up in his study, or whether he had gone out somewhere. He hadn't got scared then. If anything, he had enjoyed the space. Most kids would love to have his freedom. Getting the creeps now seemed a bit pathetic. He wandered into the kitchen, flicking lights on as he went. It was nicer there, in the cleanest and most modern room in the house. The fridge hummed comfortingly. Jonathan poured himself a glass of orange juice and thought about making some food. He hadn't eaten since lunch, and it was getting late. On the other hand, he wasn't feeling very hungry and he couldn't be bothered making himself anything complicated. He compromised on a packet of crisps and an apple. Outside, a black van rolled slowly up the street and came to a stop outside the Starling house. The driver switched off the headlights, but no one got out of the car. Jonathan sat at the table and munched on his apple thoughtfully. Mrs. Elwood had promised to phone the school tomorrow, so he was free until the weekend at least. No need to go to bed early tonight. He flicked through the TV guide, but there was nothing good on. For the 100th time he cursed the fact that his dad had refused to pay for satellite television. Jonathan wasted a couple of weeks trying to persuade him, before concluding that Alan had no idea what it actually was. There must be something he could do. Jonathan didn't mind spending time on his own. Most of the time, he preferred it that way, but tonight he wanted to do more than lie on his bed and daydream. He didn't have a computer, though Mrs. Elwood had promised him that he was going to get a PlayStation for Christmas. Alan disapproved of computers. He told Jonathan that people should spend their time reading books instead. Nearly all of the rooms in the Starling house were crammed with books, mostly tatty old volumes with long titles, missing pages and a strange fusty odor to them. Alan was happiest when he was lost in a book, legs sprawled over the side of an armchair. Apparently he had used to be an academic of some sort, though he didn't teach now. Instead he spent most of his days locked up in his study, and Jonathan had no idea what he did there. He had never been allowed in, and it was the only room in the house with a working lock on the door. The wind had changed direction, sending the rain crashing against the kitchen window. Jonathan got up and pulled the blinds shut. As he did so, he thought he caught sight of something moving in the garden. It was difficult to be sure, amongst the tangle of the undergrowth. Probably just the cat from next door, Jonathan reassured himself. Nothing to be worried about. All the same, he double-checked that the back door was locked before he left the kitchen. The landing was in a disheveled state. The rug covering the floorboards had been crumpled and one of paintings had been knocked askew. Jonathan suddenly remembered that his dad had suffered a darkening here that day. The mess must have been caused by the paramedics as they tried to get him out. He straightened the painting and shook the rug flat, trying not to imagine the scene. He was cleaning his teeth when he heard a soft thud from somewhere near the back door. Whatever it was, it didn't sound like a cat. Outside the bathroom window, it was so dark it was hard to see, but he was convinced that there was something out there, a shape hunched by the side of the house. Had they tried to open the back door? Jonathan reached for his mobile and called Mrs. Elwood. "Jonathan, is everything all right? I know it sounds stupid, but I think that there's someone prowling around outside. Should I phone the police?" "Not yet, it might be nothing. Stay where you are. I'll be over as soon as I can." She hung up. Jonathan raced around the first floor, checking all the windows. Now every sound, every creak of the floorboards and every splash of rain on the windows, had a menacing tone to it. A click from the downstairs stopped Jonathan in his tracks. It sounded like a door being quietly shut. The front door. He had forgotten to lock it, and now someone was in the house. Jonathan's heart began to race wildly. He needed to find somewhere safe to hide until Mrs. Elwood got here. His first thought was to go somewhere in his bedroom, but hiding under the bed was for little children. Instead, Jonathan moved to the opposite end of the landing. He was wondering about trying to get onto the roof through his dad's bedroom window when he noticed that the door to the study was ajar. That must have been where Alan had experienced his darkening. For the first time in his life, Jonathan could enter the study. He crept inside, closed the door, and carefully twisted the key in the lock until it clicked. There was definitely someone in the house. Though they were trying not to be heard, Jonathan could make out a careful tread of footsteps on the stairs. He sat on the floor with his back to the door, and waited. It felt fairly sturdy, but would it be enough to keep out someone trying to get in? Around him everything was in darkness. Despite his situation, a voice in Jonathan's head whispered to him to turn on the lights and explore the study. This might be his only chance. The footsteps began to explore the first floor, spending a couple of minutes in Jonathan's room. Then there was silence. He pressed himself flat to the floor, and looked out through the crack underneath the door. First all he could see was the bathroom door, but then suddenly a pair of black shoes came into view. Jonathan lay very still, trying not to breathe, alarmed by the clamoring of his frantic heartbeat. Above his head, the door handle began to turn slowly, until the lock stopped it. He hoped fervently that a locked door would put off the intruder, but the handle began to turn again, more forcefully this time. There was a high-pitched whining noise from the landing that sounded more animal than human. He froze as the door began to rattle violently. Abandoning all hope of hiding, Jonathan raced across the room to the desk and, straining with the pressure, pushed it across the door. On the landing the whining got louder, and there was an explosion of scratching on the door. The sound of the high-pitched scrabbling on the woodwork set his teeth on edge. Jonathan began blindly piling objects on top of the desk, a chair, a heavy waste paper bin, anything that could help to create a barrier. The intruder hammered on the door, which trembled under the force of the blows. Jonathan ran to the window and looked down at the ground, wondering if he could survive the jump to the garden. Then the banging and the scratching suddenly stopped. There was a pause. He held his breath in the, "It's okay, Jonathan. It's me." It was Mrs. Elwood. He had never been so relieved to her voice. Jonathan pulled the objects away from the door and opened it. She was standing in her dressing gown and slipper, with a golf club in her hands. Seeing the fear in his eyes, she started. "What's going on?" "There was a burglar," Jonathan gasped. "Someone broke in." Mrs. Elwood gave him a dubious look. "I didn't see anyone." "Are you sure your mind wasn't playing tricks on you?" "Positive." "There was someone here," Jonathan said, desperately. "I'm not making it up. Look at the door." Mrs. Elwood peered up at the woodwork. The lacquered surface was crisscrossed with long, white scratches. Her jaw hardened. "I see. Nasty. Come on. You can stay in my spare room tonight." She took him gently by the arm, and Jonathan allowed himself to be led away, but not before he had locked the study door behind him. It might be a futile gesture, but it was the best he could do. For now, he had to leave the study and all its secrets intact.